Chapter 2 Uncle Jacob. In his uncle's house, Carl soon became used to his new circumstances. But indeed, his uncle indulged his slightest wishes, and Carl had never to learn by hard experience, which so much embitters one's first acquaintance with foreign countries. Carl's room was on the 6th floor of a house whose 5 other floors, along with 3 more in the basement, were taken up by his uncle's business. It was so light, what with its 2 windows and a door opening on a balcony, that Carl was filled with fresh astonishment every morning on coming into it out of his tiny bedroom. Where might he not have had to stay if he had landed in this country as a destitute little immigrant? Indeed, as his uncle with his knowledge of the immigration laws thought highly probable, Carl might not have been admitted into the United States at all, and might have been sent home again without regard to the fact that he no longer had a home. In this country, sympathy was something you could not hope for. In that respect, Amerika resembled what Carl had read about it, except that those who were fortunate seemed really to enjoy their good fortune here, sunning themselves among their carefree friends. A narrow outside balcony ran along the whole length of Carl's room, but would have been at home the highest vantage point in the town allowed him here little more than a view of one street, which ran perfectly straight between 2 rows of squarely chopped buildings, and therefore seemed to be fleeing into the distance, where the outlines of a cathedral loomed enormous in a dense haze. From morning to evening and far into the dreaming night, that street was the channel for a constant stream of traffic which, seen from above, looked like an inextricable confusion, forever newly improvised, of foreshortened human figures and the roofs of all kinds of vehicles, sending into the upper air another confusion, more riotous and complicated, of noises, dust, and smells, all of it enveloped and penetrated by a flood of light, which the multitudinous objects in the street scattered, carried off, and again busily brought back, with an effect as palpable to the dazzled eye as if a glass roof stretched over the street were being violently smashed into fragments at every moment. Cautious in all things, Uncle Jacob advised Carl for the time being to take up nothing seriously. He should certainly examine and consider everything, but without committing himself. The first days of a European in America might be likened to a rebirth, and though Carl was not to worry about it unduly, since one got used to things here more quickly than an infant coming into the world from the other side, yet he must keep in mind that first judgments were always unreliable, and that one should not let them prejudice the future judgments which would eventually shape one's life in Amerika. He himself had known newcomers, for example, who, instead of following these wise precepts, had stood all day on their balconies, gaping down at the street like lost sheep. That was bound to lead to bewilderment. The solitary indulgence of idly gazing at the busy life of New York was permissible in anyone traveling for pleasure, perhaps even advisable within limits. But for one who intended to remain in the States, it was sheer ruination, a term by no means too empathetic, although it might be exaggerated. And indeed, Uncle Jacob frowned with annoyance if ever he found Carl out on the balcony when he paid one of his visits, which always occurred once daily and at the most diverse hours. Carl soon noticed this, and in consequence denied himself as much as possible the pleasure of lingering on the balcony. However, it was by no means the sole pleasure that he had. In his room stood an American writing desk of superior construction, such as his father had coveted for years and tried to pick up cheaply at all kinds of auction sales without ever succeeding, his resources being much too small. This desk, of course, was beyond all comparison with the so-called American writing desk which turned up at auction sales in Europe. For example, it had 100 compartments of different sizes, in which the President of the Union himself could have found a fitting place for each of his state documents. There was also a regulator at one side, and by turning a handle you could produce the most complicated combinations and permutations of the compartments to please yourself and suit your requirements. Thin panels sank slowly and formed the bottom of a new series, or the top of existing drawers promoted from below. Even after one turn of the handle, the disposition of the whole was quite changed, and the transformation took place slowly or at delirious speed, according to the rate at which you wound the thing around. It was a very modern invention, yet it reminded Carl vividly of the traditional Christmas panorama, which was shown to gaping children in the marketplace at home, where he too, well wrapped in his winter clothes, had often stood enthralled, closely comparing the movement of the handle, which was turned by an old man, with the changings in the scene, the jerky advance of the three holy kings, the shining out of the star, and the humbled life of the holy manger. And it had always seemed to him that his mother, as she stood behind him, did not follow every detail with sufficient attention. He would draw her close to him until he could feel her pressing against his back, and shouting at the top of his voice would keep pointing out to her the little less noticeable occurrences, perhaps a little hare among the grass in the foreground, sitting up on its hind legs and then crouching as if to dart off again, until his mother would cover his mouth with her hand and very likely relapse into her former inattention. The desk was certainly not made merely to remind him of such things, yet in the history of its invention there probably existed some vague connection similar to that in Carl's memory. Unlike Carl, Uncle Jacob by no means approved of this particular desk. He had merely wanted to buy a well-appointed writing desk for Carl, but nowadays these were all furnished with this new apparatus, which had also the advantage that it could be fitted to more old-fashioned desks without great expense. At any rate, Carl's uncle never omitted to advise him against using the regulator at all if possible, and reinforced his advice by pointing out that the mechanism was very sensitive, could easily be put out of order, and was very expensive to repair again. It was not hard to guess that these remarks were merely pretexts, though on the other hand, it would have been quite easy to lock the regulator, and yet Uncle Jacob refrained from doing so. In the first few days, during which Carl and his uncle naturally had a good number of talks together, Carl mentioned that at home he had been fond of playing the piano, though he had not played it much, having had no teaching except his mother's rudimentary instructions. Carl was quite well aware that to volunteer this information was virtually to ask for a piano, but he had already used his eyes sufficiently to know that his uncle could afford to be lavish. Yet this suggestion was not acted upon at once, but some 8 days later his uncle said, almost as if making a reluctant admission, that the piano had just arrived, and Carl, if he liked, could supervise its transport. That was an easy enough task, yet not much easier than the transport itself, for the building had a furniture lift in which, without any difficulty, a whole furniture van could have been accommodated, and in this lift the piano soared up to Carl's room. Carl could have gotten himself in the same lift as the piano and the workmen, but just beside it was an ordinary lift free, so he went up in that instead, keeping himself at the same elevation as the other by means of a lever, and staring fixedly through the glass panels at the beautiful instrument which was now his property. When he had it safely in his room and struck the first notes on it, he was filled with such foolish joy that instead of going on playing, he jumped up and with his hands on his hips, gazed rapturously at the piano from a little distance. The acoustics of the room were excellent, and they had the effect of quite dispelling his first slight discomfort at living in a steel house. True, in the room itself, despite the external appearance of the building, one could see not the slightest sign of steel, nor could one have discovered in the furnishings even the smallest detail which did not harmonize with the comfort of the whole. At first, Carl set great hopes on his piano playing, and sometimes unashamedly dreamed, at least before falling asleep, of the possibility that it might exert a direct influence upon his life in America. When he opened his window and the street noises came in, it certainly sounded strange to hear on the piano an old army song of his native country which soldiers, sprawling of an evening at barrack windows and gazing into the darkness of some square outside, sang to each other from window to window. But the street, if he looked down it afterwards, remained unchanged, only one small section of a great wheel which afforded no handhold unless one knew all the forces controlling its full orbit. Uncle Jacob tolerated the piano playing, and said not a word against it, especially as Carl indulged very seldom in it indeed. He actually brought Carl the scores of some American marches, among them the national anthem, but pure love of music could hardly explain the fact that he asked Carl one day, quite seriously, whether he would not like to learn the violin or the French horn as well. The learning of English was naturally Carl's first and most important task. A young teacher from a neighboring commercial college appeared in his room every morning at 7, and found him already over his exercise books at the desk, or walking up and down the room committing words to memory. Carl saw clearly that if he were to acquire English, there was no time to be lost, and that this was also his best chance of giving his uncle especial pleasure by making rapid progress. And indeed, though he had to confine himself at first to the simplest greetings, He was soon able to carry on in English an increasingly large part of his conversation with his uncle, whereupon more intimate topics simultaneously came up for discussion. The first American poem, a description of a fire, which Carl managed to recite to his uncle one evening, made that gentleman quite solemn with satisfaction. They were both standing at a window in Carl's room. Uncle Jacob was looking out at the sky, from which all brightness had already faded, bringing his hands together slowly and regularly in time with the verses, while Carl stood erect beside him, and with eyes fixed on vacancy delivered himself of the difficult lines. The better Carl's English became, the greater inclination his uncle showed to introduce him to his friends, arranging only that on such occasions the English teacher should always be at his elbow. The first person to whom Carl was introduced one morning was a slender, incredibly supple young man, whom Uncle Jacob brought into the room with a string of fulsome compliments. He was obviously one of these many millionaires' sons who are regarded as failures by their parents' standards, and who lead strenuous lives which an ordinary man could scarcely endure for a single average day without breaking down. And as if he knew or divined this, and had faced it as best he could, there was always about his lips and eyes an unchanging smile of happiness, which seemed to embrace himself, anyone he was speaking to, and the whole world. With the unconditional approval of Uncle Jacob, it was arranged that this young man, whose name was Mr. Mack, should take Carl out riding every morning at 5:30, either in the riding school or in the open air. Carl hesitated at first before consenting, since he had never sat on a horse and wished first to learn a little about riding, but as his uncle and Mack insisted so much, arguing that riding was simply a pleasure and a healthy exercise, and not at all an art, he finally agreed. Of course, that meant that he had now to leave his bed at 4:30 every morning, which was often a great hardship for him, since he suffered from an actual longing for sleep, probably in consequence of the unremitting attention which he had to exercise all day long. But as soon as he came into his bathroom, he ceased to be sorry for himself. Over the full length and breadth of the bath stretched the spray, which of his schoolmates at home, no matter how rich, had anything equal to it. And for his own use alone? And there Carl could lie outstretched. The bath was wide enough to let him spread out his arms, and let the stream of lukewarm, hot, and again lukewarm, and finally ice-cold water pour over any part of him at pleasure, or over his whole body at once. He lay there as if in a still faintly surviving enjoyment of sleep, and loved to catch with his closed eyelids the last separately falling drops which, as they broke, flowed down over his face. At the riding school where his uncle's towering motor car deposited him, the English teacher would be already waiting, while Mac invariably arrived later. But Mac could be late with an easy mind, for the actual life of the riding school did not begin until he came. The horses started out of their semi-slumber when he entered. The whips cracked more loudly through the room, and on the gallery running round its single figure suddenly appeared spectators, grooms, riding pupils, or whatever they were. Carl employed the time before Mac's arrival in practicing riding a little, though only the most rudimentary first exercises. There was a tall man who could reach the backs of the biggest horses almost without raising his arm, and he invariably gave Carl his scanty quarter of an hour's instruction. The results which Carl achieved were not impressive, and he learned by heart many exclamations of pain in English, gasping them out to his English teacher, who always leant against the door, usually in a very sleepy condition. But almost all his dissatisfaction with riding ceased once Mac appeared. The tall man was sent away, and soon nothing could be heard in the hall, which was still half in darkness, but the hoofs of galloping horses, and hardly anything seen but Mac's uplifted arms as he signaled his orders to Carl. After half an hour of this pleasure, fleeting as a dream, a halt was called. Mac was then always in a great hurry, said goodbye to Carl, patted him a few times on the cheek if he was particularly pleased with his riding, and vanished, too pressed for time even to accompany Carl through the door. Then Carl and the English teacher climbed into the car and drove to their lesson, generally round byways, for if they had plunged into the traffic of the great street which led directly from the riding school to his uncle's house, it would have meant too great a loss of time. In any case, the English teacher soon ceased to act as an escort, since Carl, who blamed himself for needlessly forcing the tired man to go with him to the riding school, especially since the English required in his intercourse with Mac was very simple, begged his uncle to absolve the man from that duty, and after some reflection his uncle acceded to his wish. It took a relatively long time before Uncle Jacob would consent to allow Carl even the slightest insight into his business, although Carl often begged him to do so. It was a sort of commission and dispatch agency such as, to the best of Carl's knowledge, was probably not to be found in Europe. For the business did not consist in the transference of wares from the producer to the consumer or to the dealer, but in the handling of all the necessary goods and raw materials going to and between the great manufacturing trusts. It was consequently a business which embraced simultaneously the purchasing, storing, transport, and sale of immense quantities of goods, and had to maintain the most exact, unintermittent telephonic and telegraphic communication with its various clients. The telegraphist's hall was not smaller, but larger than the telegraphic office of Carl's native town, through which he had once been shown by one of his schoolmates, who was known there. In the telephone hall, wherever one looked, the doors of the telephone boxes could be seen opening and shutting, and the noise was maddening. His uncle opened the first of these doors. In the glaring electric light, Carl saw an operator, quite oblivious to any sound from the door, his head bound in a steel band which pressed the receivers against his ears. His right arm was lying on a little table, as if it were strangely heavy, and only the fingers holding the pencil kept twitching with inhuman regularity and speed. In the words which he spoke into the mouthpiece, he was very sparing, and often one noticed that though he had some objection to raise or wished to obtain more exact information, the next phrase that he heard compelled him to lower his eyes and go on writing before he could carry out his intention. Besides, he did not need to say anything, as Uncle Jacob explained to Carl in a subdued voice, for the same conversation which this man was taking down was being taken down at the same time by two other operators, and would then be compared to the other versions, so that the errors might as far as possible be eliminated. At the moment when Uncle Jacob and Carl emerged from the box, a messenger slipped into it, and came out with the notes which the operator had just written. Through the hall there was a perpetual tumult of people rushing hither and thither. Nobody said good day, greetings were omitted, each man fell into step behind anyone who was going the same way, keeping his eyes on the floor, over which he was set on advancing as quickly as he could, or giving a hurried glance at a word or figure here and there on the papers he held in his hand, which fluttered with the wind of his progress. "You have really gone far," Carl once said on one of these journeys through the building, which took several days to traverse in its entirety, even if one did nothing more than have a look at each department. "And let me tell you, I started it all myself 30 years ago. I had a little business at the time near the docks, and if 5 crates came up for unloading in one day, I thought it was a great day and went home swelling with pride. Today my warehouses cover the 3rd largest area in the port, and my old store is the restaurant and storeroom for my 65th group of porters." "It's really wonderful," said Carl. "Developments in this country are always rapid," said his uncle, breaking off the conversation. One day his uncle appeared just before dinner, which Carl had expected to take alone as usual, and asked him to put on his black suit at once and join him for dinner, together with 2 of his business friends. While Carl was changing in the next room, his uncle sat down at the desk and looked through the English exercise which Carl had just finished, then brought down his hand on the desk and exclaimed aloud, "Really first rate!" Doubtless Carl's changing went well all the more smoothly on hearing those words of praise, but in any case he was now pretty certain of his English. In his uncle's dining room, which he could still remember from the evening of his arrival, 2 tall, stout gentlemen rose to their feet, one of them called Green, the other Polander, as appeared during the subsequent conversation, for Uncle Jacob hardly ever dropped a word about any of his acquaintances, and always left it to Carl to discover by his own observation whatever was important or interesting about them. During the dinner itself, only intimate business matters were discussed, which meant for Carl an excellent lesson in commercial English, and Carl was left silently to occupy himself with his food, as if he were a child who had merely to sit up straight and empty his plate. But Mr. Green leaned across to him and asked him in English, unmistakably exerting himself to pronounce every word with the utmost distinctness, what in general were his first impressions of America. With a few side glances at his uncle, Carl replied fairly fully in the dead silence that followed, and in his gratitude and desire to please used several characteristic New York expressions. At one of his phrases all 3 gentlemen burst out laughing together, and Carl was afraid that he made a gross mistake, but no, Mr. Polunder explained to him that he had actually said something very smart. Mr. Polunder, indeed, seemed to have taken a particular fancy to Carl, and while Uncle Jacob and Mr. Green returned once more to their business consultations, Mr. Polunder asked Carl to bring his chair nearer, asked him countless questions about his name, his family, and his voyage, and at last, to give him a reprieve, began hastily laughing and coughing to tell about himself and his daughter, with whom he lived in a little country house in the neighborhood of New York, where, however, he was only able to pass the evenings, for he was a banker and his profession kept him in New York the whole day. Carl was warmly invited to come out to the country house. An American so new and untried as Carl must be in need of occasional recuperation from New York. Carl at once asked his uncle's leave to accept the invitation, and his uncle gave it with apparent pleasure, yet without naming any stated time or even letting it come into consideration, as Carl and Mr. Polander had expected. But the very next day Carl was summoned to one of his uncle's offices. His uncle had 10 different offices in that building alone, where he found his uncle and Mr. Polander reclining somewhat monosyllabically in 2 easy chairs. "Mr. Polander," said Uncle Jacob, who could scarcely be distinguished in the evening dusk of the room, "Mr. Polander has come to take you with him to his country house, as was mentioned yesterday." "I didn't know it was to be today," replied Carl, "or else I'd have got ready." "If you're not ready, then perhaps we'd better postpone the visit to some other time," remarked his uncle. "What do you need to get ready?" cried Mr. Polander. "A young man is always ready for anything." "It isn't on his account," said Uncle Jacob, turning to his guest. "But he would have to go up to his room again, and that would delay you." "There's plenty of time for that," said Mr. Polander. "I allowed for a delay and left my office earlier." "You see," said Uncle Jacob, "what a lot of trouble this visit of yours has caused already." "I'm very sorry," said Carl, "but I'll be back again in a minute," and he made to rush away. "Don't hurry yourself," said Mr. Polander. "You aren't causing me the slightest trouble. On the contrary, it's a pleasure to have you visiting me. You'll miss your riding lesson tomorrow. Have you called it off?" "No," said Carl. This visit to which he had been looking forward so much was beginning to be burdensome. "I didn't know." "And how do you mean to go in spite of that?" asked his uncle. Mr. Polander, that kind man, came to Carl's help. "We'll stop at the riding school on the way and put everything right." "There's something in that," said Uncle Jacob, "but Mac will be expecting you." "He won't be expecting me," said Carl, "but he'll turn up anyhow." "Well, then," said Uncle Jacob, as if Carl's answer had not been the slightest excuse. Once more Mr. Polander solved the problem. "But Clara," she was Mr. Polander's daughter, "expects him to, and this very evening, and surely she has the preference over Mac." "Certainly," said Uncle Jacob. "Well, then, run away to your room." And as if involuntarily, he drummed on the arm of his chair several times. Carl was already at the door when his uncle detained him once more with the question, "Of course you'll be back here again tomorrow morning for your English lesson." "But my dear sir," cried Mr. Polander, turning around in his chair with astonishment, as far as his stoutness would permit him, "can't he stay with us at least over tomorrow? Couldn't I bring him back early in the morning the day after?" "That's quite out of the question," retorted Uncle Jacob. "I can't have his studies broken up like this. Later on, when he has taken up a regular profession of some kind, I'll be very glad to let him accept such a kind and flattering invitation even for a long time." "What a contradiction," thought Carl. Mr. Polander looked quite melancholy. "But for one evening and one night it's really hardly worth the while." "That's what I think too," said Uncle Jacob. "One must take what one can get," said Mr. Polander, and now he was laughing again. "All right, I'll wait for you," he shouted to Carl, who, since his uncle said nothing more, was hurrying away. When he returned in a little while ready for the journey, he found only Mr. Polander in the office, and his uncle had gone. Mr. Polander shook Carl quite gaily by both hands, as if he wished to assure himself as strongly as possible that Carl was coming after all. Carl, still flushed with haste, for his part wrung Mr. Polander's hands in return. He was elated at the thought of the visit. "My uncle wasn't annoyed at my going." "Not at all. He didn't mean it all that very seriously. He has your education so much at heart." "Did he tell you himself that he didn't mean it very seriously?" "Oh, yes," said Mr. Polander, drawing the words and thus proving that he could not tell a lie. "It's strange how unwilling he was to give me leave to visit you, although you are a friend of his." Mr. Polander, too, although he did not admit it, could find no explanation for the problem, and both of them, as they drove through the warm evening in Mr. Polander's car, kept turning it over in their minds for a long time, although they spoke of other things. They sat close together, and Mr. Polander held Carl's hand in his while he talked. Carl was eager to hear as much as he could about Miss Clara, as if his impatience with a long journey could be assuaged by listening to stories that made the time appear shorter. He had never driven through the streets of New York in the evening, but though the pavements and roadways were thronged with traffic changing its direction every minute, as if caught up in a whirlwind and roaring like some strange element quite unconnected with humanity, Carl, as he strained his attention to catch Mr. Polander's words, had no eye for anything but Mr. Polander's dark waistcoat, which was peacefully spanned by a gold chain. Out of the central streets there were theater-goers, urged by extreme and unconcealed fear of being late, hurried along with flying steps or drove in vehicles at the utmost possible speed. They came by intermediate stages to the suburbs, where their car was repeatedly diverted by mounted police into side alleys, as the main roadway was occupied by a demonstration of metalworkers on strike, and only the most necessary traffic could be permitted to use the crossroads. When the car, emerging out of dark, duly echoing narrow lanes, crossed one of these great thoroughfares, which were as wide as squares, there opened out on both sides an endless perspective of pavements filled with a moving mass of people, slowly shuffling forward, whose singing was more homogeneous than any single human voice. But in the roadway, which was kept free, mounted policemen could be seen here and there sitting on motionless horses, or banner-bearers, or inscribed streamers stretching across the street, or a labor leader surrounded by colleagues and stewards, or an electric tram which had not escaped quickly enough and now stood dark and empty while the driver and conductor lounged on the platform. Small groups of curious spectators stood at a distance watching the actual demonstrators, rooted to their places, although they had no clear idea of what was really happening. But Carl merely leaned back happily on the arm which Mr. Polander had put around him. The knowledge that he would soon be a welcome guest in a well-lighted country house surrounded by high walls and guarded by watchdogs filled with extravagant well-being, and although he was now beginning to feel sleepy, and could no longer catch perfectly all that Mr. Polander was saying, or at least only intermittently, he pulled himself together from time to time and rubbed his eyes to discover whether Mr. Polander had noticed his drowsiness, for that was something he wished to avoid at any price.